Hi, this module is focused on immigration, but in particular it's focused on the discrimination that immigrants in the U.S. focus, but not just in the U.S., it's also a global issue. So the title of this presentation is Citizenism, a Global Epidemic, and I'll go into that a little bit in detail. I'll start off with some general statistics about Latinos in Nevada. In Nevada, the Latino population is 25%. And again, these stats are going to change depending on when you're looking at this presentation and what year you're looking at. But these have been the statistics that I've used in around 2010, 2011. So the Nevada Latino population is 25%, 53% are native born, and 47% are foreign born. That means that, 53% of the people were born here in the United States, and the others were born in different countries. 78% of the Latino population is of Mexican origin. So sometimes you hear people making the stereotype or the assumption that all Latinos are Mexican. Well, some of that is connected to the fact that the people from Mexican origin have usually been the larger group of people. But obviously, that population, it changes. It changes depending on what state you're in. And even here in Nevada, the Latino population is very diverse. So one of the things that you also learn is that in the past 10 years, we've had a big population shift, right? So between 1990 and 2000, there was a 264% increase in the Latino population locally in Nevada. And then between 2000 and 2007, there was another 69% increase. And people say, well, why are all these Latinos coming to Nevada? And, and one of the things that I like to point out is that those folks came here because for the past 10 years, Las Vegas, or at least up until the biggest economic crisis and housing crisis that we faced, prior to that, Las Vegas was one of the fastest growing cities in the country, right? Along with cities in Arizona. So the population growth created jobs. And those jobs were primarily construction jobs and service industry jobs. And what happened is, when they needed people to work in these areas, they recruited low-paid manual laborers. And many of them were undocumented. Some of them were people who had documentation and authorization to be in the United States. But overwhelmingly, what they were able to do was recruit undocumented laborers to work cheaply to make buildings, for example, on the Strip, even buildings here on campus. There were people who were contracted by other contractors so that they could build things. And the reason that they wanted them was because they could pay very little for them. The other thing that that people got recruited to Nevada for was because of the housing, right? So before we had the crash of the housing and economic crash that we've had in recent times, you had people coming from California, other parts of the country who were saying that Nevada homes were extremely affordable. So because of that, people were coming here in large numbers because they wanted, improved housing, they wanted to take care of their families, and so they came for those reasons. What happened is that you had a huge shift even in the school district, right? And so right now, there's a huge number of Latino students. Compared to the 1980, when the Latino student population in the Clark County School District was only 5.3%. Today, it's at least 38.8% of the total population. And just last year, I think that's just 2010, it outnumbered white students. So Clark County School District teachers have little or no training on or culturally relevant pedagogical approaches for working with the students. And in fact, we've had a lot of experiences where either teachers or principals or school board members, superintendents have made anti-immigrant comments or anti-Latino comments. You now have administration changing and people being hired who have either a background working with Latino students or have some sensitivity training. And in California and Texas, for example, they've had a long history of multicultural training or what we call culturally relevant teaching. But here in Nevada, because the population grew in the past, let's say 10, 15, 20 years, that training wasn't necessarily there, and you have people in the school district who are now working to make up for that lack. especially because some of these teachers who were born or raised in Nevada or Las Vegas didn't necessarily have the experience of working with the population. So again, I want to point out that Latinos and Latinas, the huge jump in the population came because Nevada employers recruited them to come. Nevada real estate agents recruited them to come and buy housing. And so a lot of people say, well, why are they here? They need to go back to wherever they came from. But the reality is the economy and in terms of jobs and housing has really been dependent on immigrant labor and immigrant presence. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. I want to go back to this idea of multidimensional struggle that I talked about early on when I introduced myself. I want to recognize that along with racism, classism, sexism, etc., citizenism is an issue that people really contend with. It's an area of discrimination that many people don't know about, but me and one of my students, a former student of mine, we created this term to talk about the kind of discrimination that immigrants face around the world, right? So it's not just here locally, but globally. And the way we identify it is in the following manner. Contemporary nation states, immigration policies, and the socioeconomic and political marginalization of immigrants have created a global system founded on the subordination of non-citizens. We refer to this phenomenon as citizenism. This term was coined during our own research, and it was developed through a communal production of knowledge by the authors, right? And so what we're talking about is an article that I wrote about global citizenism and about Nevada in particular in terms of the discrimination that immigrant students experience here locally. But basically what we're saying is countries, nations around the world are built with this idea. We create policies and we create laws so that certain people have equal rights, usually citizens of that country, right? But a citizen is anyone who contributes to that nation, anyone who contributes either through their work or through their consumption or through their through their taxes, etc., is considered a contributor to society. And what's happening is you have people who are considered non-citizens but are being asked by the nation to contribute, right? They're being asked to work for low wages. They're being asked to pay taxes. They're being asked to participate in their communities in positive ways, but yet they're not being given the support to do so. So in the United States, I would argue that citizenism is a system of advantages that unfairly privileges U.S. citizens, and it reinforces an unearned and unjust citizen privilege. So just because you're a citizen doesn't mean you're superior to anybody who's a non-citizen. It doesn't mean that you have the right to be, treated like an equal, to be treated by the legal system as someone who is superior to someone who is a non-citizen, right? And for me, again, this is an area that's contested, right? People say, well, that's against the law. They shouldn't be here. But one of the things that I'm arguing is that citizen supremacy is being constructed, and it's being constructed so that people can exploit immigrant labor, and the law is being used for the purpose of that discrimination as well. One of the things that I also get into is the idea that there are different ways to classify discrimination against immigrants. So one of the words that's used is nativism, and another word that's used is xenophobia. Right? Xenophobia is basically fear of the unknown. Nativism is when people say, this is my country, leave it, right? And so you have this little comic that I put in here where it says, go back to Africa, right? And they're talking to African Americans. Go back to Mexico, talking to Latinos. And then they look at native people and it's like, where do they go back to, right? Whose nation is it? Who is really native to this country? And who has the right to claim it? And do we all have the right to claim legal protection in this nation or not? That is up for debate and depends on who you are and how strongly you feel about this issue of immigration. But what I want you to think about is, why are immigrants in the United States to begin with? How is their labor, exploited labor, connected to the exploited labor of native people in the country and of African slaves, right? Historically, we've had an economic system that has depended on the labor of exploited laborers, right, or the labor of people of color, some poor people as well, poor white people, and usually they're paid very little so that wealth can be accumulated at the top. And what I'm arguing is that immigrants are being used for that same purpose today, and they're not being offered the equal rights that other laborers have been given throughout time, and that we've actually had to fight for in terms of labor rights, right? And so this issue of legality is an important one. I think that the unequal treatment of non-citizens in the U.S. is justified through a criminalization of the undocumented person's labor migration. While citizens enjoy de jure civil rights and legal protections, this system is ineffective and short-sighted, much like the immigration policies created around the world, right? So it's not enough to just say, oh, well, that's the law and we have to deal with it. What we're learning is that immigration law is not fair, right? Certain people, specifically people from Mexico, and specifically people from the Philippines, have longer waits. They have bigger hoops to jump in order to go through the immigration process. And people will say, well, why don't they just do it the right way, the legal way? And in fact, there are many people who have gone to lawyers, who are paying lots of fees to go through the immigration process. Some of them are being misled, some of them are being lied to and taken advantage of by lawyers, because right now we're at a time where immigration law is extremely strict, right? It's extremely strict and restrictive, especially to poor people. So if you have wealth or money, if you have higher education, it's easier for you to migrate than it is if you don't, right? And so I think that that's a system of classism. It's a system of discrimination that looks at laborers, low-income laborers, working poor people, and says to them, we want your labor, but we don't want to see you as somebody who's a professional. We don't want to give you the right to migrate. Because if you don't have a higher education or some kind of wealth or class privilege, it becomes ever more difficult for you to migrate. And so I would argue, similar to what St. Augustine argued, generations ago, and Martin Luther King articulated, that an unjust law is no law at all, and that we really do have the responsibility to disobey unjust laws. At the very least, we have the responsibility to challenge the law and to learn about the law. So lots of people will just say, well, it's the law, but they've never studied immigration law. And in fact, if you take immigration law, you'll find out that many of these laws were created to create paradigms or parameters against low-income people, often darker-skinned people, and often people with low education, or not just often, but overwhelming people with low education. This is connected to this concept of capitalism, right? The idea that, in our nation, for example, the top 1% of the U.S. families have about the same wealth as 95% of the rest of the country. And what we're saying is that if you look at the pyramid, this is an old, picture from the industrial and the industrial era, but we still have a pyramid to refer to capitalism in our society, where you still have the majority of wealth, concentrated in the top of the pyramid, and you still have a large number of people at the bottom who are basically sustaining that wealth. And I think that you have to, recognize that immigrants are at the bottom of that pyramid, and they're purposely and consciously being asked to do labor for low wages so that wealth can stay concentrated where it is. One of the terms that we use to refer to undocumented people that is preferred to, the quote illegal terminology. Illegal, the reason we don't use it is because we think it is contestable whether or not their status should be legal or not. And so we want to take out that term. We also want to say that calling somebody quote an illegal is a dehumanizing process. Right? So if you want to say that they're undocumented or say that they're unauthorized to be in the United States, that's different from calling them illegal. If you take a wrong turn at a stoplight, for example, it's an illegal turn, but you're not an illegal human being. And so this is something that we feel very strongly about. The other thing is recognizing the economic situation of the whole world, is that people who are coming to the United States as low-wage labor are often people who are running away from really dire situations, people who can't afford to feed their families, who don't have money to sustain themselves. And you say, well, we don't care about their nation, or we don't care about their problem, they should stay there. But the United States is intimately connected to other parts of the world. And so we really want to, urge people to think about undocumented people as economic refugees. So an economic refugee is a person that has fled his or her country of origin, seeking to escape oppressive poverty. Having tried everything else or other things to fight for change in the living conditions of their original countries, they feel their only option is for immigrants is to find themselves, is to ensure their survival and well-being is to take refuge either in the United States or another market in different places of the world. The other thing that I want to kind of finish up with is the idea that, again, when we have discrimination against a whole population, you have the possibility of violence towards them. So right now we have a rise in hate crimes happening in immigrant communities all over the world, but particularly here in the United States. You have people who are getting beat up, and almost killed in Pennsylvania, for example. This is a picture of people in Arizona. Those are vigilantes who are taking it upon themselves to get rid of immigrants in the desert. And you might think, oh, that's good. That's their right. But here are some of the possibilities. This man was basically lynched and killed by people in Arizona because he was an undocumented immigrant. And you even have things like in Arizona where people, aren't able to depict Mexicans or Hispanics in murals without being challenged because they're too dark-skinned or unattractive for the school district. And there's a long history to this, and I want you to, look at the PowerPoint and look at the exclusion of Chinese immigrants and how that was racially motivated. I also want you to take a look at some of the myths that are, that immigrants don't pay taxes, for example. They do pay taxes. They do contribute to the economy. There's a report that was put out by PLAN, who is that is a local organization in Nevada, that debunked many of those myths. And also, I want you to take a look at the colorlines.com. They have an I-word campaign. Basically, they're trying to get us to move away from using the word illegal because we think it's a harmful, dehumanizing term. And you can look at some of the clips and you can go look at the website for more information. And I'd like to end there.